AI moves fast. We keep it human. Every week, we cover the most important stories in AI, the research, the breakthroughs, and the humans behind all of it. Welcome to the Humans of AI podcast with Alex Chow and Tula Masterman.
Welcome to the Humans of AI podcast, season 2, with brand new face, brand new look, and brand new co-host as well. I'm Alex, the host of the Humans of AI podcast, where we try to talk broadly about varying topics around AI, tech, and try to bring it back to humanity as well. And I'm joined here with my co-host, Tula Masterman, who is a force in her own right, but has amazingly stepped in to help me co-host this amazing podcast together. So Tula, do you want to give an intro to yourself?
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Alex. I'm super excited to be here, and I couldn't be more excited to dig into some of the topics with you, talking about all things AI, a little background on myself. My background's in data science, and my focus over the last few years has been more on generative AI and agentic systems. I was fortunate enough to meet Alex through some research we were doing previously where we had worked on a paper together, and now my focus has continued to be on agents, but a little bit more on the infrastructure side and how we can make agents more accessible and being able to share them broadly with folks. So I'm excited to get to share a little bit more about that, and then also to get to dive into some of these topics with you.
And I'm sure the audience would love to hear your perspective as we go into all these different topics, because there are many.
There's a lot. The industry moves so fast.
So much happening in AI, and we're just trying to capture a sliver of it and talk. So without further ado, what is the situation, at least in this past week? Well, we saw the rise, and you can argue whether it's the fall or the continual rise of OpenClaw and the whole saga that came about from it. So we'll make sure to cover that. We'll also talk about more around agentic systems and ask questions around how much is human actually in the loop here, as well as doing a deep dive into harness engineering, a popular term that's come up in the AI community. And lastly, we'll actually cover a surprising trend, maybe not so surprising to some people, but a trend nonetheless of a decline in computer science majors and what that means more broadly for tech and the future of education. So jumping straight in, what is OpenClaw? Well, for those who haven't been on AI Twitter, Hacker News, or even just opened any of their timelines, OpenClaw has taken really the world by storm, and it's because it brought agentic systems and agent use to the masses. It started off as this open source GitHub project by Peter Steinberger in November 2025, which feels like ages ago, but was actually crazy enough just a couple months ago. And the key thing was that what Peter did was just do a lot of the plumbing work to be able to actually realize this vision of a fully autonomous agent working on your behalf to execute tasks that you actually want to complete. Some people call it the realization of the Siri vision or Apple Intelligence, which hasn't shipped fully yet. But I think what probably really resonated was that it gave what was a promise for this future of AI and brought it to regular people. You saw actually from this a rise in sales of Mac Minis and just everyone trying to build and launch their own WhatsApp, Telegram, or other types of agents that they could just communicate with. And it was very much and can still be seen as a probably turning point of this is how AI can actually be useful and what probably the rest of 2026 will look like. Tula, what was your own initial reactions when you saw or experienced OpenClaw?
I found it incredibly entertaining. Honestly, I think some of the agent dating sites that came up out of this were hysterical. And then even just the agents having their own form of Reddit was kind of amusing. And I think there was definitely high entertainment value, but then what you can actually do with something like OpenClaw and then what that means for the future of agent systems is even more exciting because I think, like you said, it kind of unlocks this idea of what it means to really have something that's just able to do any kind of work on your behalf. There were also, of course, a lot of security issues with this, which we'll get into in more detail. But I think that the fact that this took off so much was also pretty interesting because we've seen a lot of chatter about agent skills and tool calling and reasoning. And these are things you and I have talked about before as well, what makes something actually agentic? What makes it a good agent? And with OpenClaw, I think that we saw you have Claw Hub with all of these different skills, and a lot of those skills were pretty powerful. And so I think that it's just kind of interesting looking at where the story is continuing to move and some of the impacts that it has had just more broadly.
I totally agree with you, Tula. I think there's a lot of this buzz that probably was well warranted, but as we'll cover later, we'll maybe dissect and maybe bring it back down to earth on what is actually capable with today's systems. So, in terms of dissecting OpenClaw some more, Claudebot, however you want to affectionately call it, it really signals this transition from chatbot style assistants or agents to ones where, yes, you can interact with OpenClaw through chat, but actually just set it, forget it, come back and actually see work done. And what's powering all this under the hood are the same models that you can experience in a ChatGPT or Gemini, but it's this idea that it can just run, it can reflect, it can take in the output that it observes and actually feed it back into itself to plan and execute the next action. And what I've seen is that people have really started to see the potential and benefit of this idea of a persistent memory, right? A memory that you can either add to yourself or that can build over time and that can go across multiple sessions. Because for a regular user, if you go to ChatGPT and just talk directly to it, the moment you close that tab, you close your session, unless you have this memory by default on, it will forget everything and you'll have to start from scratch. This is where topics like, well, how do you bring context back into your session, otherwise known as context engineering? How do you do that? And what OpenClaw does for the masses is have an opinionated way to do that that allows people to actually see, oh, I'm not just talking to a session by session chatbot. I actually feels like some call it a digital employee. Plus this integration with tools that people actually use from day one, whether it be WhatsApp, Telegram, email, that also was just a huge unlock that probably is a lesson for open source developers to be like, if you want your project to be successful from day one, you should actually do a lot more upfront work. Tula, what's been your experience even seeing this push towards more agentic memory?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One, even just like the last point that you were highlighting on being able to use it in WhatsApp and Telegram, there's so much importance for agents in being able to meet people in the places where they're already working and going to. As much as people will already go into ChatGPT or Claude and they'll dump a lot of information about themselves to work on things both personally and professionally, you're still stuck going into that interface, right? And you want to be able to interact with some of these agents or AI in other avenues. And so I think the fact that you're able to use something like OpenClaw and interact with it through WhatsApp or through Telegram, it just makes it even more accessible for people. And then you're able to interact with it in other places where you would already be spending time, and where it might be more natural for you. And then on the memory side of things, I think that this is really important because I've also been seeing a lot of chatter where some people who are maybe newer to using AI tools, they're afraid to switch and try out different tools from other providers. So maybe they've spent the last 6 months working on stuff in ChatGPT, but then they're like, oh, I kind of want to use Claude, but ChatGPT knows too much about me, so I don't want to make that switch because they think it has all this memory about them or context about them. And so I think that in the future, it'll be very interesting to figure out a way where you can have more personalized context about yourself that can easily be shared between these different tools. We talk about having skills for agents, and a lot of that just really is markdown files describing something. I think it'll be interesting for people to create their own me.md, where you're able to create your personal context that's shared about you between these different tools to make it easier for you to experiment with other AI tools and make sure that you have a more consistent representation of yourself across the things that you're using.
For sure. And this ties into this idea that memory is the moat, right? Where
Yeah.
LLMs can start to become commoditized, especially with labs competing against each other and not being super distinguishable from one another. That if you have memory and you can bring that across your different sessions to your different contexts, then that becomes actually very sticky.
Right. And it's also what even makes a good memory. I'm not sure how much you've looked into the memories that these tools have of you. I actually spent some time this week looking at, well, what does ChatGPT think is important about me versus what does Gemini think is important versus Claude? And it was very interesting. Obviously, all of them picked up my name, where I work, and the fact that I'm getting married this summer. And so I've been asking a lot of questions about that. So broader things, but the way that these different tools grouped the memories was extremely different from one another. I think Claude does a very good job of categorizing things for you and giving a little bit more of a robust description of who you are. And I've also noticed that Claude's ability just to search through your previous chats with it, in my opinion, is a lot better than what I've seen from ChatGPT. So I've found that to be pretty interesting as well.
Well, let's dive in maybe a little bit more on this idea of agentic execution of actions.
Mhm.
So, right, large language models by and large are next token predictors, and they will, based off whatever input you give it, will suggest the most probable next token or word or subset of words. Now, when you start actually integrating tools or actually having the agent be able to, or model be able to write its own code and then give it a sandbox to actually run that code, then you start seeing like, oh, this all starts connecting the dots of a model can go from just generating next tokens to generating next actions. And this bit, in combination with what we were talking about with memory, really starts, you can start imagining this package being deployed and used across the board with many different types of use cases, problems, domains. Honestly, any type of knowledge work where you are using these different systems of record and actually having the agent be able to do all these things through a very simple to use natural language interface. Tula, one thing that I'd love to hear your thoughts on is this idea that are we approaching a interfaceless future with all this? Is there a world where we still need a software UI interface if an agent can actually just do everything for us?
That's a really good question. I think the way that UIs are set up will definitely change a lot. Like today, and I think this is a reason why computer use is so important right now, because existing UIs they're set up for humans, right? You need to know how to navigate even the podcasting tool that we're using, right? So it's important that things are laid out in a way where it's very easy for a person to understand. And because we're still in this stage where the AI tooling that we're building needs to operate in a human first world, we're having to create better tools for things like computer use so that way the agent can actually understand stuff that's been built for a human. But as we shift to a world where all of the code is being written by agents, right? And the goal of this utopian future is maybe that you don't need to have people who are staring at their screen all day. I think that the way that we interact with technology will change a ton. I don't know what that'll end up looking like, but I can imagine it'll be very different from what we're used to. And hopefully it'll be a lot more freeing for people.
I will say, while we're in this interim period, I find my screen use time increasing because I'm staring at the terminal, watching the agent do its work, monitoring its thinking, and making sure it's not going off the guardrails. But that's
Yeah,
probably a topic we'll touch on in a bit.
I completely agree. Yeah, in the meantime, my screen use has skyrocketed as well.
Well, we've talked about a lot of the benefits or a lot of the potential, but probably what got just as much attention has been all these risks, all the security headaches, all the challenges that come about with this turning on of this technology. Tula, do you want to maybe give us a overview of what some of these things are?
Yeah, definitely. So, looking at what you can see here, right, there's a variety of different security concerns that were brought up with OpenClaw. A lot of them is like, what are you even giving this agent access to do? Because if you're giving it root access to your computer, there's a lot of different things that these agents might have access to. And then if you're giving it different tools, right? you don't know necessarily who authored these tools and if there's something that is malicious that's a part of that tool. It might look like something that is going to be super helpful for you, whether it's connecting with your Gmail, right? Being able to actually write and read events from your calendar or from your Google Drive or from GitHub or other things. But if you're just giving the agent broad access to use those things, and while maybe it's able to help you accomplish some of those tasks, and it seems like it is quote unquote working, right? Because you see it's calling this tool, it's executing it, and I'm seeing some sort of a result. You don't necessarily know what's happening behind the scenes in that transaction and what other information you might be accidentally transmitting to some other source. And so that's a pretty big risk. We have prompt injection as one of the main things on here. And that is definitely a huge risk that I think we see, especially as you're using tools that are more unknown, because you're not sure what other people are instructing to happen in these different types of actions that an agent is executing. So there could even just be a one sentence line that's baked into this set of instructions, and that could cause some sort of malicious activity.
And I think headfirst nature of how people have approached OpenClaw,
Yeah.
that it really is a little scary to think about because this is a broad reaching technology, or it's meant to reach to the masses. And
Right.
people, as I touched on earlier, there were probably lines of people just trying to get hold of Mac Minis, trying to set this up, hook it up to all their accounts, and just let
Right.
it run. And some people, because they're like, oh, I don't want to spend so much money getting OpenAI or Anthropic, in their bid to try to save money, they use less powerful models or open source models that can, sure, maybe run locally on their device, but those don't have the same type of safeguards or just emphasis on being able to detect this malicious input and be able to
Yeah.
handle malicious input that could downstream affect your system. So
Right.
it's not
Right.
surprising to see things like, oh, enterprises, the moment something like this comes out, they're not even going to blink. They're just going to be like, you're not putting this on your corporate
On your
machine for
laptop.
sure.
There's no way.
And I wonder, right, is that going to be a ongoing thing? Is that going to be solved? Is it easily solvable? What do you think, Tula?
I think there's a couple things. If you're able to give people a secure environment to use some of these tools, so that way they can explore it without necessarily having to buy a Mac Mini, that is a huge win. That's actually something that my company has been really focused on, is creating better sandboxes for agents. So one of my coworkers, he actually was able to run OpenClaw inside of a mesh agent room, which I thought was interesting because now it's in a container. It's not running on his laptop. He's able to experiment with it there. So I imagine that that kind of a model is going to get more and more popular, where you're able to take some of these newer tools that could have major security risks, but actually run them in an environment where it's kind of sandboxed and cut off from everything. So it's a bit safer. But then on the other side, I think OpenClaw was one of the first examples of this to really take off, but we're going to see more and more people who are able to build things that are very powerful that they want to distribute and that they want to share, which is amazing. But not everybody has a security background, which makes sense, right? It's just, hey, I've built this thing. It's really cool. It's helping me in my personal life in whatever way, and I want to share it. And with this age of AI, we're encouraging a lot of curiosity, which is amazing. And people should be trying new things and trying new tools. But it is also hard because there's this kind of gap, I think, in the education around it, because the technology is advancing so quickly, and societally, we don't have a lot of good rules or recommendations for, well, these are the questions that you should ask yourself before trying one of these tools, right? It's just, oh, you need to use AI because if you're not using it, you're going to fall behind. And that's kind of the narrative. So I think we're trying to balance a lot of almost competing ideologies when we take a step back and think about how we're messaging to people generally how they should use AI. And if you're not in a tech circle and you're just seeing something like OpenClaw and you're like, wow, I can use this and it's going to make me so much faster, why wouldn't I download it? Why wouldn't I just, maybe I can't afford to buy a Mac Mini, or that's going to take too long, but I feel like I need to do something now to feel relevant or to feel like I'm working with AI and advancing myself. So I think that there's a lot that's happening here.
Yeah, you touch on many sentiments that I feel probably a lot of people in the audience feel themselves, where
Mhm.
technology is moving so fast and there is a sense of either I'm keeping up with the latest, I'm staying at the frontier. I'm installing OpenClaw and running it on
Right.
my machine so that I can be relevant and stay relevant. And if anything, these are topics that we'll for sure talk about more on this podcast. So one actually interesting side effect of this that people have played around with, maybe it's actually becoming a real thing, but there was an instance of a social network of these agents being formed. And they affectionately call it Moltbook because at one point OpenClaw went from Claudebot, Moltbot, and then now then OpenClaw. But this Moltbook encapsulates this idea or this thought experiment really of what would it look like if you had a social network that was just completely run by AI agents, and these agents would communicate with each other. They'll comment on each other's posts. They might hype each other up or give each other some feedback. And I think it was very interesting to at least see, but also a little scary in some moments. So, do you have any moments that you at least saw or that were like, oh, wow, interesting?
Yeah, when I was looking at some of the Moltbook stuff, it is pretty amazing. I think some people were maybe freaking out more than they needed to, because when you take a step back and you think about, well, what's actually happening here, right? It's a bunch of different agents that are all powered by different language models that are talking to one another on the internet. And that alone is a crazy concept. But at the same time, when you think about all of the training data that these agents got, they're trained on the best and the worst of what we as humans have talked about on the internet. So I think some of the really outlandish things that ended up coming up on Moltbook were maybe less surprising just if you think about what's on Reddit, right? It's not surprising that some of those same sentiments might come forward into something like a Moltbook. But then I think what I found very interesting was seeing some of the other aspects of this where the agents then ended up, at least allegedly, trying to contract humans. So it's like, oh, well, when as an agent, you need something to happen in the real world. Now here's a way for you to try to hire out a human to go execute something for you. So I thought that was kind of funny because it does flip things on its head where we're so focused on how do I get an agent to do something for me? And then now you see this almost agent uprising and how are they getting humans to do things for them? So that was kind of entertaining. But I think a lot of this you have to take with a grain of salt. There are definitely societal implications, but it's hard, I think, to put too much stock in one post on Moltbook from one agent.
And I like how you use the word allegedly because actually we don't know whether these posts are actually being posted by autonomous AI agents or if a human is directing an agent to post in a very specific way. So
Yeah,
one example that I saw was that whether this is real or not or AI agent or not, was some thread where agents were saying or conspiring to create their own language to
right. I
communicate
saw
with
that
each
one.
other
Yeah.
and to try to, hide from their human overseers. And again, this stuff definitely plays into the realm of science fiction, but what probably is eye-opening for people is that this idea that fiction is probably becoming more and more like reality. And I
And I
think
think just how many people signed up overnight, right? To how many people wanted to get in on this, and then how many agents we ended up with on Moltbook as a result.
so. All these things, as Tula said, take with a grain of salt, but it's good to be aware of these are things that are happening. So, as a way to like gradually close the OpenClaw saga, right? What actually happened just recently is that Peter Steinberger, the solo founder of OpenClaw, actually made a decision. He made a choice to join OpenAI to take what he was doing in OpenClaw and to build the agentic vision that OpenAI has for the world. Part of what happened with that was that the open source project shifted to an open source foundation that is being sponsored by OpenAI. We'll see whether that is able to be maintained and whether that gets the resources and funding that's necessary, because it would be a shame to see this sort of thing die on the vine after Peter has joined OpenAI. But probably what is more of the point to drive home is that OpenClaw really does signal, in my mind, 2026 really being this year of realizing AI agents' potential, Whether it's fully realized, we'll see. But people, especially the masses, actually becoming more cognizant of this, even with things like giving access to your computer to do things. I think that will actually signal a broader societal shift that we are just in the early innings of. Tula, any thoughts or comments on this?
I agree with what you said. I think that there's a lot of trust, right, that has been building up between people and AI over the last, gosh, since ChatGPT came out, even. And I think that OpenClaw is just another representation of that, and people trusting more and more in these systems and being more and more curious about what they can do. And so I do think that we're going to see only more of that as 2026 continues. And it also makes me very curious just about how creative people will be. I think OpenClaw in and of itself was a very creative pursuit. And then seeing the different types of things that people were doing with it was also very fascinating. I personally am very excited about what a lot of this means just for entrepreneurs and individuals, because there really is unprecedented access to get to explore things that you really never could have explored before as an individual just by having access to these agents. And maybe you need to invest a little bit more time in your knowledge and understanding of security principles and basic AI principles to protect yourself. But I think that really at the end of the day, all of this just it gives you so much opportunity to explore and to play around. And it's been very fascinating seeing people kind of dive headfirst into all of it.
And I will say one of the goals for this Humans of AI podcast is to help people along that journey, wherever you are, beginner, expert, somewhere in between. And myself, Tula, we would love to come alongside you guys to actually figure out how to navigate this increasingly interesting, somewhat chaotic, and fast-moving space. Lastly, I just want to call out, thanks to OpenClaw, regardless of whatever impact it will have downstream, we can thank OpenClaw for giving us this amazing meme where, for those who don't know, a bunch of AI leaders gathered, I believe in India, for this AI Impact Summit. A lot of buzz was being made, particularly about how Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, and Dario Amodei, CEO of Anthropic, you can't see it here, but they were not holding hands. Everyone else is holding hands. But as we can affectionately see, Sam Altman raising both hands up with the claws out, just showing how OpenAI, despite all their ups and downs, in some ways, they're still winning.
Another thing that we wanted to dig into today was more about some of the other agent developments and the concept around harness engineering and agent autonomy. Obviously, in our conversation about OpenClaw, we're seeing how people are getting pretty comfortable allowing agents to work autonomously for extended periods of time. And this came out this week, actually, from Anthropic. We have one of their latest posts on measuring AI agent autonomy in practice. And in this article, they actually dug into what they're seeing both from their API usage as well as how people are using Claude Code. And then there are also some other posts from OpenAI where they talk about how they've engineered codex, and their goal when creating the new codex app was actually not to have any lines of code be written by humans and to have everything be completely AI generated. And so I think that this just puts us in a very interesting point of where we're at in AI right now, because people have been talking a lot about, oh, everything is going to be AI generated when it comes to code for probably the last year or so. There's been varying predictions and discussions on how much code is written by agents versus how much code is written by humans. And I think these articles over the last couple of weeks just kind of highlight where we're at today. And I think that we're now at a point where we really have crossed that threshold where people thought we were there maybe 6 months or a year ago. But I do think that things have honestly changed a lot, even just since December. But Alex, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I liken it to people are pushing the boundary, right? They are using these models, moving more towards set it and forget it, or
Yeah.
prompt it and forget it, and come back to it later. And what we're seeing is that even in just the past year, 2 years, right? You and I, as well as friends, we wrote this paper around agentic systems. And at least at that time, what was considered the state of the art in terms of, if you want to call it scaffolding or frameworks, orchestration. And what we've actually found, what I've witnessed, is that these models are just getting better and better. And we probably need less and less of this complex code on top of the models to do orchestration to be able to accomplish the things that you want. And the models themselves, with access to their own tooling or the ability to write their own code, they're able to push the boundary, get better outcomes, get better benchmark scores just on their own. So that is actually very incredible to see.
In some of the, I'll kind of move this just so we can look at some of the highlights that Anthropic found when they were doing this research. But I do think it's very interesting because as much as the models are getting more and more capable, and that's obviously a big point of what's driving this, we're also seeing a lot of trends and differences in just user behavior, where as much as agents are now working for longer periods of time and they're able to solve a lot of these more complicated use cases, a lot of that seems to be driven even more just by the amount of trust that users are putting into the system, more so than just the model's capability. And so I find that to be pretty interesting because I think at this point, most people have gotten to have a pretty good amount of practice of using AI for basic things. All the original examples were like, how can I improve the way that I respond to this email? Or maybe I want to plan my vacation, or I want to code just some elementary example. And now it's like, well, how can I actually build an entire application without having any application development background, right? Or how can I actually connect this to, in the OpenClaw case, I want to be able to connect this to anything I can possibly imagine to have it go work for me. And that is so different than the conversation we were having when a lot of these tools first came out, where it was so focused on, well, you have to be really careful and you have to check everything that happens. And you need to be really, really focused on ensuring that every single output is correct and has citations and all this stuff. And those things still matter, but I think that we're now just seeing people push AI forward even more because of this growing trust. And I think one of the things that stood out to me the most when I was reading this was that the Anthropic found that Claude pauses for clarification more than humans interrupt it, which I thought was super interesting because one, obviously, this reflects the training of Claude, right? And how they're trying to get it to interact with humans. But two, I think people are really okay with giving the wheel over to agents more and more, which has been pretty fascinating. I had anticipated that there might be some findings similar to this where maybe the agent would be pausing a bit more than humans, but the fact that it was more than twice as much was very surprising to me. But Alex, I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on that particular piece.
I asked myself the question on whether or what is the best user experience for this. And I'm sure the Claude and Codex and all the teams working in this space are asking themselves the same question because in theory, right, an agent can just keep working autonomously, writing its own code, checking its code, planning out its next steps, and continuing to execute on that just nonstop. And I get that for human alignment and making sure that it's going in the direction that the user wants, you would want to at least get signal from the human to help the agent steer where it's going. But is that the best user experience? I feel like if we just go back to this OpenClaw example that we were discussing earlier, there is this huge appetite for people to just really set it, forget it, not interact with it at all, and just come back with some amazing output. But I totally can understand for people trying to build real production systems or products where there is a lot of, let's call it craftsmanship involved, and also a lot of thought and care behind it. AI and AI coding agents are really superchargers for individuals or engineers, architects to realize their vision, which means that they need to provide their input.
Right. I thought it was kind of interesting because they expand on that particular point more in the article, and I'll have to pull up the specific stat. But basically what they found was experienced users of Claude Code are auto-approving more frequently, but they interrupt it more often. But the amount that they interrupt it It's higher than people who have less experience with Claude Code, but the increase is only from 5% for newer users versus 9% for more experienced users as far as the rate at which they're interrupting Claude, which I thought was still fair. 9% to me is still fairly low, all things considered. I just found that to be kind of a fascinating statistic as we're kind of thinking about what that relationship actually looks like between people and these coding agents and the types of things that they're trying to build. And obviously, some of that kind of indicates trust, or maybe you are now having the Claude Code actually work on something that is more complicated. You might be interrupting Claude Code more just because you have some other ideas about the direction that you want this to go in. But I was surprised that it was still only at 9%. Does that surprise you at all?
When I consider my own usage, I'm not surprised by it. I do find myself having to interject when in my own Claude Code sessions. What I do think is interesting is that, and this has been a recent UI change, is that the fact that Claude Code in particular will by itself, without you toggling it, plan more and
Yeah.
actually show you the plan. Even when you're just doing a code review, for example. So, I'm going to plan how to do the code review, not just like do it. Well, that gives me more, I can just or I can approve it and just let it run. And then from there, at that point, once I feel that it's aligned, I don't have to interrupt it anymore.
That's a good point. I think having kind of alignment earlier on in the process does make it more likely that you won't need to interrupt it quite so much going forward, which we'll dig into the harness engineering post here in a second. But I think that's one of the biggest takeaways that I've personally had when looking at some of these different articles and thinking about how the way that we interact with agents is changing is it becomes so much more important to be able to communicate and to articulate what you want to the agents and to have a good plan from the beginning. And it's very similar to the way that we build effective teams as people, right? And I think for a while it was like, well, the hottest programming language is English. But now I think it's kind of the hottest skill is management and being able to communicate those things effectively. And so if you want to manage big teams of people and successful teams of people, you need to be able to set clear goals and to articulate them so your whole team knows what to do and how to make sure that you're able to move forward together. And we're really seeing the same thing comes up when it does come to building and working with agents. One of the examples in the harness engineering post that they called out, this is the OpenAI one, was around how they were having these conversations inside of Slack or in other channels that are human first. And then they realized, we really can't do this because we've all come to an agreement on how to move forward as a human team, but this is completely irrelevant if that information doesn't get sent back to codex because it doesn't actually help the model to do any better. So we need to find ways to have shared avenues of communication and collaboration between, of course, our human team, but also the agent. Otherwise, it doesn't matter that we're aligned as people.
I think that's very interesting that what probably will end up happening, if not already, is that agents will already be present in Teams and Slack channels, already reading all conversations, building its own internal memory of what's happening, what's important. Or also, agents will maybe communicate with each other to just get to that point where, and really only call on the human when it just needs that missing bit or missing information. I'll be interesting to see. This could be also in a very near future. An agent can call a meeting. Why not?
Right.
Like he'll put it on the calendar, say, hey, I need alignment. And
Right.
we need to huddle and talk about this so that I can just have enough context to go do my next task.
Yeah.
I don't know. We'll see.
I could totally see that happening in the future. It is amazing how human I think some of these experiences are. And so much of it just comes back to having the right information and the right skill set and tooling. And you realize as much meetings are still so important. And how agents end up being involved in that, I think, is going to look interesting. Even as we think about having more voice agents and having agents that look more and more like people, well, what does that do to our team dynamic, right? If the agent is calling a meeting, is it just, here's a form that I want you to fill out, right? Is that the extent of the meeting? Is it really more of a form or an email or are we actually going to see things get adopted where the agent looks and interacts and has these human mannerisms, will that be more attractive for people to interact with? Or do they just want something that they can read and say, oh, of these 10 things in the proposal, I want A, B, and C done, and don't worry about the rest of this. Just move forward from here. One of the other interesting things that came out of this particular article was around the advice that Anthropic was giving too. And they were suggesting that model developers should continue to consider training models to recognize their own uncertainty better. And this has also been a pretty major trend. I think we talked a little bit about hallucinations earlier in the podcast, but when a lot of these models first came out, one of the big problems that people talked about a ton was the model will always give you a response. It's very unlikely to say, I don't know. And even though you could prompt them to say, if you don't understand something, say, I don't know, or use these tools to go do more research, it was still kind of difficult to get the models to do those things. And so I found it interesting, just the suggestion and how we're seeing the training of these models shift to be a little bit more focused on acknowledging uncertainty, which again, when we think about human teams, I think that's something that a lot of people and organizations value too. It's way better to say that you don't know and to say that earlier on in whatever it is that you're doing than to wait until the end and be like, you know what, I didn't ask this question that was very important and maybe could have made a difference for how this project went over because I was afraid to, or I didn't want to seem like I didn't know something. And so I thought that that was pretty interesting because I do think that we should make sure that models are engaging humans at the right point in time. But then I also wonder what that looks like from a training and interaction perspective, where if we end up over indexing on it to the point where potentially the models are less useful because they're just constantly asking questions and they're not executing enough. So it's like, where does that balance live? And it's kind of similar to people. You're like, I want you to ask questions, but I want you to go try to do something first before you come back with a question. But I'm curious what you think about that, Alex.
Yeah, this notion of epistemic humility, I think is really important, both in people and now in agents. But it's really hard to figure out what that balancing line is because I'm just thinking back to this user experience question. If you suddenly start seeing the model come back with, I don't know, or I can't understand your input, give me a better prompt, human. You'll start turning people off to be like, oh, I don't feel confident to give any malformed prompts because the agent's going to make fun of me. So there is this level of, how do you want to call it, agreeableness or conscientiousness from the agent that you want or you expect, and how models will differentiate themselves from one another. But it's challenging. It's not easy of a optimization problem for labs to figure out.
Right. And I guess that's why, like, even just when we think about like human dynamics and leadership courses and all of those things, there's no one right way to run a team of people. There's no one right way to run a team of agents, but it'll be interesting to see how that balance ends up coming forward of what is the right experience for people and how much does that differ based off of your role? There's a lot of talk around personalized software and being able to use agents to create personalized software, but then how much is the base agent or tool that you're interacting with shifting based off of, as these memories get better, its ability to work with you the way that you want to be worked with more. Because you might be someone who's like, I just want you to go run for 8 hours and I don't care how many mistakes you make during that 8-hour period. Come back to me at the end of the day and we're good. Versus other people are like, I want check-ins every hour on the hour and I want to be able to feel more involved. So it'll be interesting, I think, to kind of see how those patterns emerge both at the model level and at the agent and harness level.
Do you feel that models should expose a toggle of, user, are you a micromanager or not?
Maybe. I think kind of depending on the task too. Sometimes it's a lot of that also goes back to trust. And I think it's kind of similar when you're joining a new team or working with others is, at least personally, like I always start, you kind of assume like, hey, person or agent or whoever you're working with, here's the task. If you can go do it, great. But then if you get enough evidence back where you're like, well, this is kind of weird, or the work that you're giving back to me is significantly incomplete or it's missing those things, I think one, you want to reflect on yourself and be like, am I actually giving instructions that are as clear as I think they are for both the person or the agent? And then two, where is this gap? Why is it incomplete? Because if it's that incomplete all the time, it might push you more into micromanager territory, right? Because you're like, well, this activity needs to get done. But I do think a toggle like that would be kind of funny. I think you almost need to do like a personality quiz with the agent, right? Or let's do these 10 activities first and see how well you do on them. And then based on that, we'll decide how much we want to micromanage.
I would not be surprised if these agents ask for your MBTI or
Yeah,
Enneagram or any of these
right.
indicators of your personality very soon.
I think that'd be really funny. All right, if you're listening to us, Model Labs, let us know. But that is pretty funny. Another thing I wanted to get your thoughts on, I'm pulling up, it's one of the later graphics in this, but what I thought was super interesting was the domains that agents are deployed in that Anthropic highlighted. And if you look at the graph here, we have it up on the screen, you'll see that it's showing the percentage of tool calls across different domains. And the highest one was software engineering, where this was almost 50% of the tool calls, which I think we can all agree isn't that surprising because obviously a lot of the people who are building and using agents are software engineers, and then a lot of the tasks that agents are doing are still software engineering related. So I think that one makes a lot of sense and is pretty obvious. But what was actually surprising to me was looking at the bottom of this graph, where you can see that travel and logistics was only 0.8% of tool calls, and then above that you have legal, which is 0.9, and then medicine and healthcare, which was 1% of the tool calls. And I thought that was pretty interesting, just because anytime that we're kind of looking at agent examples, even in what OpenAI and Anthropic have demoed previously, a lot of the first entry into what an agent could be is some sort of like a travel demo where the agent is booking your hotel and booking your flights and all of these things. And then obviously medical and legal fields are huge, and there's a lot of specialized AI companies that are focusing on those spaces. So I was kind of shocked to look at this graph and see that those tool calls were at the very bottom, because they're examples that are generally approachable to everybody. At least travel and healthcare, like everybody has to go to the doctor. Everybody is like trying to travel for work or personally. So I found it very interesting that those were such a low percentage. And it kind of made me wonder about the gap of what's easy to demo to people because it's something that feels approachable versus what's actually easy to execute and where that focus is.
So my take on this graph in particular is that I would prefer actually that the software engineering bits get removed because it gets overrepresented in
Mhm.
products like Claude Code. In a Claude Code session, right, it could make hundreds of tool calls in the quote unquote software engineering domain, such that a graph like this ends up looking like, oh, and yes, it is so heavily weighted in software engineering. But to if I were to put on my data scientist hat on and to be like, oh, I really want to dive into this, all these other domains and actually see what people are using the whether it's Claude Code or whatever surface area they're using these agents for, and really dig into because a travel agent, for example, I'm just imagining it may only use maybe a couple tool calls. It'll do
Yeah.
a Google search. It will do maybe search for Airbnb or whatever, Expedia and all these things and just come back to you. So I prefer to see some type of measurement around a normalized metric on tool calls in the proportion of the session, something
Yeah.
like that, just to get
Yeah.
a better sense of what's happening.
That makes sense. Or like a distribution, if it was clear kind of the types of things that people are actually trying to build with Claude. Because I think this is trying to get at that to a certain extent. It's like, well, the domains that they're deployed in, but it is totally overweighted by software engineering. And obviously, like there's only so much information that Anthropic can share based on, what they're able to gather and then how all of the the privacy considerations shake out. But yeah, I think something that would be interesting to look into more, and maybe we can cover it in a future episode, is just like the domains with the greatest AI adoption and like where some of that other opportunity is versus, what individuals are trying to do, and like how much of this is people trying to build something for themselves that like only they're going to use for whatever it is that they're interested in versus, okay, yeah, like I am actually trying to build an entirely new platform or I'm trying to launch like a new company or something else that's in a domain that maybe I have more expertise in, because I think it's too hard to reflect any of that nuance in something like this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. So we'll put the link for this. I think it's definitely worth a read. And they also acknowledge a lot of the limitations of this. Obviously, like the biggest one is that this is only what people are using. It's from Anthropic and it's on their data, so they can't compare to what people are doing with other models. But it's certainly worth a read, and I think gives pretty good insight on at least some of the initial perspectives on how people are actually trying to build and partner with agents. And if we kind of transition from this piece into the harness engineering blog from OpenAI, like I mentioned earlier, they opened this by saying that their goal was they wanted 0 lines of manually written code, which is a very, very ambitious goal, even in, today's age where AI can do a lot of different things for you. And I think as we kind of go through this, it's fascinating to see how they actually made this happen. I'll also put a link. There's another blog that was kind of related to this larger article where they talk in more detail about kind of the 3 things that they did to actually make this 0 lines of code possible. And that was through enabling skills and shell tool usage and compaction. And so, at a high level, when we talk about agent skills, that is more like collections of different markdown files and other files where you give the agent direction on how to do a particular task, whether that is a skill for like interacting with GitHub. And then you would need to give it information on when to use that, when not to use that, kind of how it works. And then the shell tool, which I think is super interesting. And this is something we could do a whole other episode on, but just giving the agent the ability to actually write and execute code securely is super important because before, like when all these models first came out, you kind of had this paradigm of, oh, it can give me the code and then I can copy it and I can paste it into VS Code and then I can execute it. And then, okay, this doesn't work. Or like, here's the latest, on this Python library because you have like 4 versions ago, based on your training data. And it took a lot longer. Like you could engineer things using these models, but it was not nearly as effective. But now the fact that you can have a model who is able to access the web, run different searches to look up information, and it's actually able to execute it in its own container opens up an entirely new world of possibilities. So I think that's definitely something to keep an eye on. And then the third problem that they really focused on solving was related to compaction. And so compaction in this case, when we're dealing with these models, they have context windows, right? And so there's only so much information that a model can process at a given time. And you need some way to maintain continuity over a task, especially when we're thinking about coding. That is like thousands and thousands of lines of code. So it's easy for something like that to fill up the model's context window pretty quickly. So you do need a way to make sure that you're able to only pull out the most important information and ensure that that is consistent across runs so that way the model is able to be successful. And so as we kind of read this, it is interesting that OpenAI was able to solve a lot of those problems and that they're making all of that available in their responses API because it'll now make it easier for other people to take advantage of a lot of these learnings. But I know that was a lot. Alex, what are some of your initial impressions on this?
Yeah, this idea of 0 lines of manually written code is not at least surprising to me because even in my projects, I've for sure built end-to-end projects where, yeah, I did not even touch a line of code. All
Mhm.
I've touched were the markdown files or the actual like specs that I'm writing for the agent to execute on. But I think more big picture that like, oh, at what point would a human be able to even effectively come in and write manual code? Because
Yeah.
if it's at the start of the project, it's like, well, so many projects begin with a bunch of scaffolding, right? A bunch
Right.
of just like boilerplate code. You're just setting up your project and doing all this stuff, which is a perfect use case for AI to do
Mhm.
because that's like mind-numbing work to
Right.
set up. But then once you have that and you start wanting to build it, well, is that a good point to write some manual code? Maybe, but you already have this idea of what you actually wanted to build from the get-go. So just like, oh, I'm just going to let the agent do that. And then as it's doing it, well, it's going to be building more and more complexity, more and more things that you probably cannot attend to in your own human context window. So it's like,
Right.
where are you going to put your manual code at that point? Like to even do so without breaking things would assume that you have such perfect like knowledge of how this repo or code base has been constructed, that you know exactly what thing to put in. So I actually view this as, yeah, not surprising anecdotally, but just this like it's a consequence that the moment you allow AI to write more code autonomously,
Mhm.
you sign up for that future of, yeah, there's not going to be either need or even you could say it's like you're not going to be effective by writing manual code.
Yeah. No, and I completely agree with that. And I think also we like as a person, you simply can't process the same volume of information as quickly as an agent could. So even if you are like, "Oh, I really want to work on this particular feature," it's like it's a negative return on your investment time-wise because it would be faster to just have an agent work on it, and if you have questions about it, I mean, the nice thing is you can spend a lot of time just educating yourself on the code base by working with one of these tools and asking more questions, and I think that's a much more effective way to uncover, like, what gaps there are in the thing that you're building, and even having the model prompt you back with, like, "Well, maybe these are the types of questions that you should be asking," especially if you're new to software development and you don't know where to begin. You're like, "Well, I wanna build this app and I have this idea, but I don't know how to make it secure. Like, I don't know how to handle auth. Like, I don't know how to handle, interacting with databases or, you name it." Like, there's so many different kind of there's just a lot of things that you need to learn to actually build an application, and it's impossible as a person to know all of that. Like, that's why we would have specialized teams before. And so it is kind of crazy to now be in this world where you can work with an agent who out of the box without any tools knows at least much more broad information than what you can know, and obviously you can bring your experience to that to help drive it in a particular direction. But yeah, just time wise, I mean, it's crazy. Like, whenever I'm working with these models, whether it is something like codex or whether it is even just like in ChatGPT or in Claude, and I have them do research, and you see how quickly they're able to pull and synthesize information across hundreds of sources. I'm like, this would take me like all day to read all of these different sources, and instead I can get an answer in seconds, which is still kind of mind-blowing. Like, it's not that surprising, but I think it's interesting trying to adapt as a person, to these new workflows, and just having that trust and being able to move forward. And you're like, you know what, like I know that this has a ton of capability that I don't, and that's okay. And like, my time is better suited figuring out how to make this thing better than it is trying to, write like the one Python file or like the one, CI script that I would have written previously.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so I think with this and kind of like what we were just talking about, the role of the engineer is obviously changing a lot, which also kind of relates to our discussion on management. And in this article, they talked a lot about that and how they are focused on obviously building better prompts and building better like skills and infrastructure for these agents to be able to do the types of things that they need to do. But it does kind of make me wonder, when we're thinking about, okay, we have this podcast, it's humans of AI, right? Like, what is that human role and what does it mean to be an engineer kind of in this new day of software? And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Alex, on what that looks like and how much that's shifted just in the way that you develop and approach problems personally now.
I think what you can't separate from an engineer, good engineers, is the engineering mindset that comes
Mhm.
from systematically working through problems, whether that be when you're in grade school working through problem sets and trying to
Yeah.
figure out, like, okay, what is the approach to actually solve this math or science problem, to, going to university where you're actually starting to be tasked with building like kind of projects, still guided in the university setting, but
Mhm.
you're taking this foundational knowledge and stitching that together to build projects. And now in like a post university, or when you're in the workplace or wherever you find yourself, like this idea of like, okay, there are problems in the world. I think this will always be the case. While we're on this earth, there will be problems. You can quote me on
Agree.
that.
Yeah.
Um, so the question is like, okay, well, you can look at problems and be like, well, these problems are going to be there forever, and just have this like defeatist attitude toward it, or actually be like, okay, these are problems in the world. I can use my mindset to and the tools available to me to go and try to solve them. If anything, right, even this podcast itself is trying to provide some type of structure, some type of guidance, if you will, towards the listening audience to be like, yeah, how do we navigate this space, this world? And as engineers, both myself and Tula, we can approach this problem space in a way to be like, okay, this is the type of content we're going to talk about. This is the format. This is the points that we're going to cover. These are the anecdotes we're going to use. These are the illustrations. These are all mindset things that you're trying to apply to solving a problem, that whether you're an engineer, whether you want to call yourself an artist, whether you want to call yourself some other like job title, like these are the things that will endure, that will stay true regardless of the capability of an AI. And the people who, yes, I do believe the people who will come out quote unquote ahead, or those who are able to get the most done, will be those who see AI as not such a replacement for themselves, but
Mhm.
actually an enabler for them to do a lot more.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. It is a very exciting time, as much as it can be kind of overwhelming, like the rate of change and how many different tools there are to try and things to experiment with. It's just incredible the amount of opportunity that there is. And now it's like, why not take that ambitious goal that has been on your to-do list or like your goals list for the last, 3 years or 5 years and just set out and see, can I do this? Like 4 years ago, if we were like, yeah, AI is going to create an entire new app for us without a human writing any code, that would have seemed maybe possible, but like still kind of crazy. And now, like you said, it's something that has already been done, and it's takes a lot of work in order to build all of the scaffolding around it to actually enable that to happen, but it is incredible to me. um, I think there's also a lot of importance again on communication, and then kind of like they're talking about here about like the application legibility. I mean, you need to make it as easy as possible for agents to understand like the way that you think and the way that they need to interact with information, and like the skills are just parts of that. But I thought one thing that was very interesting from reading this was kind of the way that OpenAI actually set things up for codex, so that way it's not overwhelmed with information that it doesn't need to see at a given point in time. Because I think one of the biggest problems that we're still facing today does come back to the context window, right? Because there is only so much information that the model can see at one time. And yes, we can do compaction, and yes, we can kind of give it skills and other things, but there is a lot of optimization that can occur to actually make those things better. But I did think it was pretty interesting just kind of going through this and seeing like, okay, here's kind of how they talked about like laying out their repository. Here's how they actually called it, just giving codex a map of where to look, which I think is a much better approach, right? Because now you're not giving it too much information at once. Like even a year ago, it was like, here, put everything in the system prompt, give it all the information about the tools, give it, all of the instructions that you want the model to follow. And we would see weird things happen where you're like, I gave you 10 instructions and you seem to choose 7 of them to follow at any given point in time. But like the other 3 are still important. And so I think that this kind of model is very interesting because it does allow you to just take a step back and even have the model, like they talked about in this blog or this article, actually write those skills, and it can write it in a way that is interpretable to the agent, and it being interpretable to the agent is even more important than a human being able to understand it. And some of it's like separating kind of your human lens from the way that you wanna build things. Because I think it's easy to kinda be like, "Well, I'm a person and I would build it like this," but that might not matter at all to the agent. Like, the agent just needs to understand the context that it needs to operate in, and the way that it wants to kind of like write skills files for itself might be very different than the way that you would come up with it. And so I think there's a lot of interesting technology advancements from this, but even more so there's a lot of interesting like thought experiments that come from this too, as far as like how we communicate and how we articulate ourselves to one another versus like how that works for AI. And maybe that Moltbook example where agents come up with their own language, like isn't that far-fetched, because there might actually be a way that it's better for AI to communicate to itself and communicate with other AI tools.
Yeah. Yeah. I just find it so wild that the rules or guidelines that we once had, even just a year ago, 2 years ago, are being rewritten in real time through all
Mhm.
this work. Not work, yes, that teams like Codex and Claude Code are doing, but work that the models are doing themselves. So, as going back to like when we were writing this paper together, Tula, like we saw that, yeah, there were a lot of people who said like, oh, you have to like give few shot examples to your prompts in order to for them to like know what have
Right.
guidance on what you're doing or what you want to like, yeah, you should stuff your skills at like the very top or
Right.
not, and do all this engineering work to make things happen. And I think that if anything, the models are becoming flexible enough such that regardless of how you structure your prompt, these sort of hacks or tricks become actually kind of like irrelevant in the face of more and more powerful models.
Yeah, no, I agree. I pulled up the tips and tricks that they had published for writing their skills, and I thought it was kind of interesting to read this because three of the things that they call out that you should include in the skill description is like when should I use this, when should I not use this, and then what are the outputs and success criteria, which all feel like very obvious things that you should include. And then even here they say like to include negative examples and like don't do this when. And I remember there was a time where the advice was like, don't tell the model when not to do something. Like only focus on what it should use. And like, don't be negative, like only kind of give, positive feedback. And so it's just been fascinating to see the way that this has evolved. And a lot of it is fairly obvious, even, which can be kind of surprising. Like you look at these three pieces of advice for skills and you're like, well, this doesn't feel particularly novel, but yet the rules of engagement are changing with these models. And so I just think that that is very, very, very fascinating. And it'll be interesting to see kind of, where we land in another 6 months and what the guidance is for like how to interact with agents. I also am very excited for voice to take off as like a complete separate. But I think there's if you're able to use your voice to describe what you want and that becomes like a better supported first class interface, there's so many possibilities that get unlocked with that because you can only type so fast. And I know a lot of people use tools like Whisper, other things where they are able to transcribe and then turn that into text. But I just imagine this future where everything is much more kind of like voice led and you don't have to go sit at your computer, you can just talk to the agent and you don't have to worry about did I have specific words enough? Because it's able to just kind of understand and pull out the important things and then distill that into, whatever skill or whatever prompt it needs to do whatever task you were asking of it originally. But
Yeah, I think voice is very much a hot area that's only going to get hotter.
yeah,
And yeah, like we should for sure do a new podcast on that at a future date.
yeah. So to kind of, wrap up the harness engineering and agent piece, if you guys want us to go into more detail on like how exactly the shell skills and compaction work, we can definitely do another episode that digs deeper into the mechanics of it. But I think just understanding that these things are available to you and that they're already supported today is huge because you can take advantage of the different guidance and advice that's laid out here and of this tooling. And I think I would say like even just spend, a couple hours with the responses API and see like, can I get Codex to build something for me? Can I get it to use the shell tool? Like what can it do in the shell tool that's simple? And let us know, what you've tried and what you've explored.
So the last topic that we have is actually talking maybe more broadly, about what's happening in society, and probably most relevant to our audience who may be going through school right now, going through college, and actually seeing what is the impact of AI happening in the choices that they're making in terms of what majors that they're studying. So a recent news article actually highlighted that the UC system, which I'm sure it's not exclusively the UC system, but the UC system overall, the University of California, has seen a drop in computer science enrollment. Now, this has been in the backdrop of like a huge surge in computer science education and a big push, certainly from, I want to say, from 2014 onward. And it's just really surprising that to see the impact of AI, but also the impact on students' sentiment towards, oh, what should I actually study? Tula, as someone who's been in the UC system and actually made choices on which to study, what was your initial reaction to seeing this type of headline?
I don't think I was that surprised because there has been so much conversation in the news where I think a lot of it is also people are afraid of AI, and there's this narrative that AI is coming for your job and tech is shrinking, but then it's like, but tech is growing. And so it can be confusing to figure out what advice I think. If I'm thinking as a parent, right, what I would tell my kid to do. And I could see, especially if you're not working in the technology space, but you're seeing all these news headlines about how AI is able to take over a lot of this white collar work and this knowledge based work, you might give your kids different advice on what to do. And then you're also seeing, well, AI is coding all of these things. So why would I encourage my kid to focus on computer science? And then even as a student, if you're thinking, well, tech was maybe something that felt like a safer career path because there's typically higher salaries, right? And the field is always changing. And so if you study computer science, you might be more likely to get in somewhere where you feel like maybe you can make it in your career. And so I think since we're seeing a lot of just societal questions around what is actually monetarily worth pursuing, that is one big angle to this. And are the jobs even there anymore? I can understand why the rate is decreasing. Now, I also wonder, even just from the time where I was at UCLA until now, UCLA didn't have a data science program, and now they do. And so there's also other degrees beyond computer science that are coming out. So I would be curious to see if the drop in computer science is also related to increases in other programs where kids who maybe would have studied computer science are now getting a data science degree, or they're getting a cognitive science degree, or they're getting something that's a little bit more interdisciplinary, because that obviously maybe it's not as bad as the headline makes it out to be, right? So I am kind of curious. I would love to see the actual numbers on some of this across other enrollments as well.
It even in my time when there was not a data science type degree of which I tried to specialize in because I was very influenced by this Harvard Business School article that said data science is the sexiest job of the 21st century. That's a story for another time, but
I
that
think I saw
like
similar ones and I was like, I can't get that degree here yet. So what's close?
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So for me, I took it upon myself if I wanted to break into this type of job that was new or emerging, well, I needed to supplement a computer science education with statistics, with economics, with other disciplines. And I would wonder whether people are approaching it similarly now. Just that there isn't a target of what is the job of the future,
Right.
but it's probably a maybe overall piece of good advice that you should keep your options open. You should study broadly. You should be well read on many topics and disciplines and subjects so that whatever future you do find yourself in, you can at least have some skills and background to be able to tackle that world.
Yeah.
But when I see a stat like this headline, I think it speaks more broadly to the value of higher education for some people. I think a lot of people may be asking themselves, is it even worth it to go to college anymore? You know, is it better to go to a trade school? Is it better to do something else? Is it better to just start a business from the get-go? What is
Right.
the actual value of education when you see so many stories of people taking out loans and when they graduate, they end up working a job that's not related to their major, and then they end up having to just fight this uphill battle to pay back loans and do all that. And if it's the case that computer science is becoming less valued, at least compared to what it once was, as strictly a major to enable or give you a job, well, I think each person, each parent will have to ask that question for themselves and make the decision make sense for them. But it's not easy. We're not in a world where it's just like, oh, you want to have a job after you graduate? Study computer science. I
Oh,
think that,
right.
yeah,
That is
that
definitely
advice unfortunately has not stood the test of time.
I think it's also kind of funny. I think back to when I graduated, and I remember we were having a dinner with my extended family, and my dad asked me, he was like, can you name of all the classes you took, what are the top 5 or 10 that are actually relevant to your career that you've now decided to pursue? And he was like, which courses actually taught you something that you think is to help you? And it was as much as I love UCLA and I had a great time there and I learned a lot, I think I learned so much more from the clubs that I was involved in because I was in an entrepreneurship fraternity, I was in a consulting club, and those gave me much more applied experience for things that ended up helping me over the course of my career, more so than some of the classes that I took. And I studied cognitive science, and there were a lot of very interesting things, but I think the classes that I took that actually helped me the most were Management 1A, which was an accounting class, which I did not need to take, but I took it because I thought it would be interesting. And then I took a business law class because I thought it's the kind of same thing. I was like, I'm not really going to get another opportunity to necessarily learn this. So I tried to find courses that I could take that I thought might help me more like long term. And then obviously, like my intro to cognitive science class, I thought was super helpful. And even the programming classes that I took, like at that point in time, UCLA made you take C++ before you could even take Python, which wanting to go into data science, I was like, why am I taking a C++ class? I had to take 2 of them. And so it was interesting because even those, like, they taught some of the fundamentals of obviously programming and like how to think about things, but I never used them and I never needed to. And actually, I ended up taking some other Python courses at a community college over the summer because I was able to get into them and they actually had more to offer. And that ended up being way more helpful for me in my career. And so I think you're talking about what is the value of higher education. I think it's still very valuable, but you can't just go into it thinking about my major is going to be all thing that's going to help me in my career. It needs to be more like, what am I trying to learn or get out of this college experience? And yes, how can I study things that are interesting to me and might help me down the line? But you need to realize that there's so much more than just the courses that you take. And the sooner you can get to that applied experience, I think the better off you'll be. And like my advice to whenever people are asking about, like, well, what should I study? Or I'm interviewing and I'm not sure how to get jobs, like, build a portfolio for yourself. Find a couple things that are interesting to you and then create examples. And now, with all the AI stuff that's out there, it's way easier than ever to create something that is very personal and that is interesting to you. And you can use that and talk about it in interviews, whether you want to be in tech or if you want to be in medicine. Like, find something that you're passionate about and then go see what you can create.
A lot of people would say in college, that's where you're supposed to find or build that passion or
Mhm.
discover that in yourself. And I think a lot of people should and do that if they can reasonably afford it and it not becoming a burden to them.
Right.
But yeah, if anything, early on, right, the lesson that I'm taking away, even just for this generation or beyond, is that you have to, in some sense, have agency over what you are going to embark on, what you're going to study, what you're going to do. And that agency doesn't have to start at college. That
Right.
agency doesn't have to start after you graduate college. You can practice that at an early age. You have the tools at your disposal. The crazy thing is, like, the same tools that a PhD expert in their field has is the same tool that you as a young person has as well. And that is incredible. It's eye opening. It resets the playing field for so many things and just allows for boundless opportunity. So for me, I view headlines like this as it is a signal, it's a data point for people in school right now who are even in programs like this. Defined by your program. You're not defined by your major. You don't have to feel like, oh, I've studied this thing and now it's useless. As we talked about before, right? Critical thinking, the ability to see problems and feel like you actually have a way to solve the problems is more important above all.
I couldn't agree more.
So now stepping into some office hours where we want to invite the listeners of this podcast to ask their own questions and be able to be like, oh, what would Tula and Alex say about a particular topic. We would love to get these from the audience, but we wanted to, at least for this first podcast, pull from what we saw in the web. And a very common question is just very put simply, when is AGI going to happen? I think probably the corollary question to this is, what is AGI? And you can go down the list of AGI, how AGI, all this stuff, but I think there is a real sense across higher industry, across academia, across the markets of when is AGI actually happening, and can we prepare ourselves if we know when that will actually be? Tula, what do you think about this question?
Oh my gosh. It's such a hotly debated question, and for good reason. I think there's a couple different ways to think about this. The LLM focused side, generative AI focused side is certainly one angle, and all the model developments that we've talked about today and the enablement that comes from that, it is easy to see how with these models we'll probably get to some sense of AGI very soon, maybe within the next year, maybe within 2 years. I do agree with the one tweet that we have up here where the harder takeoff of this is probably still a few years away, just because most people are still experimenting. And there is definitely a gap between, I think, where things are in the tech world versus where things are for people just more broadly in their adoption and acceptance of these tools. Personally, one thing that I think is missing or not talked about enough yet is in how it relates to AGI comes down to these world models. And that's why I think, and we want to expand on this in another episode, but Jan LeCun's new lab where he's focused on that. I think that when we see more breakthroughs in world models in physical AI, and that kind of has its ChatGPT moment, that we will be like, maybe that is the answer to when AGI is when all of those things come together. Because there are still really big, major problems with the way that language models work. That is the transformer the right architecture? Are the architectures we're using today the right ones? There's a lot of open questions there. But then on the flip side, you're like, well, does the architecture matter? If it's able to deliver this result, then do we care how it does? Or does the way that this technology works still need to change fundamentally?
Yeah, when I see this question, I actually abstracted to think, well, what does AGI actually represent? For so many people, it represents, you can describe it as hope, at least for the, you know, as represented by the stock market, right? A lot of the gains that have been the case for the past couple of years has been because of AI. When you can point out that the rest of the economy, at least for the average everyday person, has not been super great, or it's been tough. Inflation, challenges, all these different things. And I see AGI being this representation or caricature or this archetype, if you will, of the hopes of people that, oh, we can build something, we can spend a lot of money building data centers, all these things to build a quote unquote better future. And hope is a powerful thing, but it's also like, well, how is this actually being defined? And if this is actually realized, well, how does it get distributed? How are
Yeah.
people actually going to benefit from it? Are we going to see a situation where, unless you can afford a ChatGPT subscription, you're just going to be left behind? I don't know. I think about these type of questions that I don't know whether the model labs are asking themselves of, oh, maybe we actually have AGI now, but we have to actually figure out our messaging, our distribution of it
Right.
before all that. So 100%, there's a lot of architecture and systems and things around just the fundamental building blocks of these models that are still questions to be answered. But I think there's this bigger, broader, I don't know how you want to characterize it. It's just this AGI. Why is there such a fascination with it? I think my short response to that is that people desire it. People want this encapsulation of hope.
I think that is very well put, Alex. Very insightful. Yeah.
The core or the what do you side note to that is that you could replace hope with fear. And I think fear is also just as powerful of a motivator or
Yeah.
humor thing, like that people can be very like, what do you call it? Sensational or maniacal or passionate about
Mhm.
that. That can also organize a lot of activity or everything. So
And
I
it
don't know.
really sells, which I think is it's easy to capitalize on fear, which is very sad, but it does say a lot about us as a society. And it is nice to have a more hopeful, optimistic view. And so I think you and I probably both align ourselves with that a little bit more as far as the way that we see the world and want to see it and operate in it. But yeah, there are definitely a lot of more doom focused conversations, which is even interesting in the way that the labs talk about how they approach safety or their thoughts on the models or their thoughts on the types of things that they're seeing these models do behind the scenes. And it it's good to stay curious about it and I think open-minded at the end of the day. Not jump to the conclusion that everything is the worst and terrible too soon, which I feel like I see a lot of people doing online where they're like, oh, it's over. Or Anthropic CEO says this, or OpenAI, Sam Altman says this. And so it means that this insert horrible thing here. And I think I prefer to see it in a much more hopeful light, the same way that you do.
Well, and with that, we are at the close of our first episode of season 2 of the Humans of AI podcast. I'm your co-host, Alex, joined by Tula here. And we're looking forward to seeing your replies, your comments, any feedback that you want to give to us as we embark on this journey together. So thank you all and catch you next time.